Hi again everyone, my name's Steve and this is Little Plastic People, and in today's video we're going to be taking a look at painting up a piece of terrain with a few easy to learn techniques, including fast and easy paint chipping with liquid mask, sponge texturing, dry brushing, decal application, efficient edge highlighting and universal shadow colouring. So if this all sounds interesting to you and you'd like to know more, hold on for a second and let's get to the video. Okay, just a quick note about this piece of terrain. It's created mostly from parts available from a Kickstarter that I've been working on with the people from Mad Gaming Terrain, combining the best of MDF and resin printing. There's a link in the description for those who might want to take a look, and support would be very much appreciated. But shilling done, let's get back to the video. Okay, so here we are back at the hobby desk, but now in the new studio space. And here's the piece we'll be working on today, plus a sneak peek at a miniature range that I'm working on. More about these knightly fellas in another video though. As you can see, this piece is made up of multiple resin printed parts attached to an MDF structure. The thinking here is that the MDF provides an inexpensive, robust and fast to assemble skeleton for the less robust but highly detailed resin to attach to. Personally, I'm really happy with what we've achieved here. It's so modular and detailed, not to mention robust. You could knock a person out with this thing. Anyway, now it's all disassembled, we can get to giving it a nice clean, smooth coat of primer. So I drop a surface protector on the desk and get to work. I'm using Vallejo Black Surface Primer, thinned down with a little water and thinner through the airbrush. But rattle can or brush application would work fine here too. After making sure there's a good solid coat on every surface, I grab the wife's hairdryer and speed up the drying process. Being careful not to overheat the piece, which could warp the resin or pop some of those glue joints. After a few moments to cool and dry, it's time for the first colour. I've chosen burnt iron from Vallejo's metal colour range, as it goes great through the airbrush and is a nice warm and dark tone to start from. But any silver will do really, whether that be through an airbrush like I'm showing here, sponged or just simply painted on, it's all good. Now that we have a solid coat covering all of the surfaces, it's time to speed up that drying process again. Before moving on to the next stage, which I'm going to be honest, you could probably miss if you're not working as fast as I am here. I give the whole piece a coat of gloss varnish to protect the silver from what's coming next, making sure it's all dry and cured before moving on to how we're going to achieve that convincing chipping with very little effort. And that's with some liquid mask, sometimes called liquid latex. After grabbing some leftover sponge chunks and the liquid mask, I pour a little out onto a tile palette. Now for the simple but very important part. I shape the sponge by ripping and tearing off any clean and straight edges, trying to rough up the surface with a random texture, before dipping it into the liquid latex and having a test dab to see what the pattern looks like. Happy enough, it's time to gently dab the latex around the piece, focusing on the areas you feel would receive the most wear, but not going too heavy. At least that's not the look I'm going for. You could go really heavy and have a more worn look. After a little time working over the piece, making sure that I'm happy with the amount and the placement of the chipping, I leave it to dry for a few minutes while I prep the next stage. Now, as before, you could apply this coat with a brush or a sponge, but I find an airbrush much easier and faster for larger pieces. Plus, it gives a really nice smooth and even coat. So if you're on the fence about picking up an airbrush, I definitely recommend it, particularly if you're painting large things like terrain. Grabbing a nice dark red down from the rack, I mix it up with a little water before pouring it into the airbrush and giving the whole piece a solid coat in a couple of passes, letting it dry in between. I'm using reds in this example, but the same principles and techniques can be applied to pretty much any colour, just work from dark to light. Check out some of my other videos for examples of different armour colours. Next we're going to use some burnt red to start that zenithal lighting effect. This essentially just means that we're going to try and colour the surfaces that face up into something slightly lighter, just to give the effect that this thing is outside in the real world, being lit in a natural environment. But now it's time to start adding some texture to this worn and battered terrain piece, and hopefully fast. Starting with a deep red, I apply a heavy sponge texture to all of the upward and side facing surfaces. leaving the deepest recesses in shadow, before moving on to a little dry brushing. Now this isn't a sponsor spot, but the very kind Byron from Artist Opus did give me a full set of brushes the last time that I bumped into him, as I was a little skeptical, being an ardent Raphael 8404 and makeup brush user. But I can honestly say that I've really enjoyed using the Artist Opus brushes recently and would definitely recommend them. So thank you, Byron. Using the big boy from the Series D set, I dampen the brush before giving the whole piece a gentle dry brush of cadmium red, ensuring the strokes stay consistent, working from top down, reinforcing the subtle zenithal lighting effect we're working towards. Using the same cadmium red, but thinned down in the airbrush, I smooth out and reinforce some of that texture and lighting established with the dry brush, before picking up some light orange and repeating the process. Now, although this does look okay, I feel that the red has been washed out a little too much. So to bring back some of that saturation, I thin down some Bile Red contrast paint and create a very thin filter and give the whole piece a light coat. It's important to emphasise how thin and subtle this coat is, as going too heavy will wipe out any of the texture that we've spent time building. Now with that done, we can move on to some of the very initial shadow colouring. Grabbing my secret sauce down from the rack, essentially just thinned inks with Flow Improver, I give the piece a pretty heavy coat from underneath and into the shadows. This mix is so Flow Improver heavy that it really does find all of those recesses and doesn't tend to stain the flat surfaces. And once dry, we have the basics set and can get on to the fun parts, the chipping and the detailing. So remember the liquid mask from earlier? Now it's time to remove it and reveal some super awesome natural looking chipping. But as those that have used it before may have experienced, it can be a bit of a pig to remove. However, although a little messy, using a soft rubber to gently abrade the surface works a treat. Particularly something like the pencil style rubber that I've got here. So after a little time going around the piece removing all the mask, we are rewarded with something that is already perfect for gaming with. But if you know me or have watched any of my previous videos, you know that we're not going to stop here. So out come the decals. We're looking to apply decals now, as the next painting stages are going to focus around weathering. We want to weather the decals at the same time so that they look consistent and in keeping. It's also a lot easier to apply decals to freshly painted and smooth surfaces. After spending a little time sorting through and picking out the decals that I think will suit, I prep a shallow tray with a little water and start cutting out the decals that I'm going to use, dumping them into the water and leaving them to soak. Once soaked and loose from the backing paper, it's time to start applying them. Using a knife and a medium-sized brush with an OK tip, I carefully pick up each decal and place them where I think they'll look best, ensuring that the surface is already a little moist before application. This helps stop the decal from curling or deforming, and is also helpful in manoeuvring the decal for those final adjustments. Once in place, I often use the edge of the brush to roll over the decal, pushing any trapped air or water out from underneath. This helps make sure the decal stays in place and reduces the risk of frosting later. This is simply where the decals can sometimes become a little bit frosty looking once they've dried, particularly once they've been varnished. I'm honestly not 100% sure why this happens, but my best guess is that the varnish dries and pulls the decal away from the surface slightly, leaving a tiny gap between the decal's underside and the surface. But let me know in the comments if you know for sure. Once in place and dry, it's time to hit each decal with some Microsol. This relatively inexpensive product is magic for anyone looking to work with decals, particularly on rough or curved surfaces. The kit comes with Microsol and Microset. Using these essentially melts the decal to the mini, creating a painted on look, particularly after a quick varnish. Okay, so we've got some great looking decals in place, but they all look a little too clean and tidy. Out comes a fresh scalpel blade and I start scratching and chipping each decal, just enough to make them suitably worn. This process can take a little time and does require a steady hand, so as not to rip the whole decal off the model, which does happen and it's absolutely fine. So take your time and have fun with it. Once the decals are all set, I grab some more of the secret sauce mix from earlier and start quickly washing the recesses along with a quick rough wash over the decals. This helps blend them in even more and starts to clearly identify the model's details. With those details clearly identified, we can start the highlight process. Now, you might be thinking, and possibly rightly, only a madman would think about edge highlighting an entire terrain piece. But hear me out, we're not going to highlight every edge. We're just going to be focusing on the most impactful edges, which are facing upwards and towards any incoming light. Every edge doesn't need painting, just those that will bump up the model's overall contrast and make it read nice and punchy from 3 feet away. So, starting with a light orange, I use the side of the brush and run it along the most impactful edges with a mix of tapping and dragging motions. Really focusing around the corners and changes in direction that are facing up and the areas where I want to see a little more of the available detail. Next, I take the same approach with a light stone colour, but only touching the corners of the previously highlighted areas. Again, we've come to a stage where this is looking great. It really pops from a few feet away and hasn't taken us an age to get here. So feel free to stop and crack on with the next piece. But, you guessed it, I think there's still more to do, particularly as this is still looking far too clean. So out comes a green premix that I use quite a bit to filter metals. This is a mix of green paints, inks, thinner and flow improver. Essentially, it's just a thin contrast paint at this point, so feel free to sub it out with something similar. I run this mix into the details, focusing along where the dirt and grime would collect. I repeat the process with a more blue verdigris colour, thinned with a little water and flow improver to help it stay in the deepest recesses, focusing tightly around the corners and smaller details. I also use a little of these mixes to drag a few drips and streaks down from a few spots. Now commonly you'll see browns and oranges being used for grime and dirt in this way, but as the backdrop is red, these aren't going to give us a good enough colour contrast, hence why we're going with the greeny blue. Okay, so we're getting there now, but I think we have space for a little rust, even though it won't stand out too much against the red. So out comes some dirty down rust, and after shaking the ever-loving monkeys out of it, I apply it to an already moist surface, using a wet brush to smooth out the edges and move it around the model until I'm relatively happy with the placement and strength of the effect. This is particularly important as dirty down is great, but can give a really heavy rust effect in areas where it's on very thick, which I feel can look a little out of scale. Once dry, with a little encouragement from the wife's hairdryer again, I grab a little rust wash and smooth out the rusted areas. Still feeling like there isn't enough orange rust in the deepest spots, and generally having a bit of fun with all of the weathering, I grab some enamel rust wash and drop this into a few of the deeper spots. Completely unnecessary really, but hey, it's fun to test things out occasionally. So after a little more messing around with the rust effects, it's time to work on that universal shadow colour that I mentioned at the start. I leave this right until the end, as it's very much a filter for the whole piece, so applying it earlier would probably complicate matters. Using some Leviathan purple contrast thinned way down, I apply it through the airbrush from directly underneath the model and into the areas where the deepest shadows will collect. Finally, as is tradition on this channel, I give the whole thing a coat of ultra matte varnish to finish. And with the magic of editing, here is the finished piece, including all the metal parts, all painted with the techniques I go over in my Painting Better True Metal Metallics video, which I've linked in the description for those who want to know more about the full process. As you've probably figured out by now if you've got to this part of the video, you don't have to follow this example stage by stage. You can pick and choose, adding in or skipping as you like. And although it may not be the fastest way to paint terrain, I do think it's one of the more economical, as there isn't anything super difficult to pick up here, and each step stacks nicely onto the last. But hey, I'm biased. So let me know what you guys think down in the comments. On a side note, would anybody be interested in a less abbreviated video? So no audio, just sped up video of the whole process, dealing more of the actual brush strokes, maybe over just a soundtrack. Might be helpful for some, let me know. And before I go, just another quick reminder about the Complex 3D Kickstarter campaign underway at the time of this recording. If you like the look of what you've seen here and the sound of MDF plus resin terrain, take a look at the description below and follow the link. Any support would be very much appreciated. Anyways, that's all for now. Thanks for watching, subscribe, share, and all that good stuff. See you next time. Bye!